Hi, you're welcome to today's episode of the Tech Talk Wednesday with me, Kazeem. And today we're going to be talking about support for open source on Azure. And I have Santosh Hari with me to help us with today's topic. Hi, Santosh.
Hi, Kazeem. How are you?
Yes, very well, Santosh. Thank you very much for joining us on the show. So let's begin things with learning a little bit about you and what you do, Santosh.
Sure. So, my name is Santosh Hari, and I live in the United States, Florida in particular. But I'm originally from India. So I grew up in India. I moved to the US as an immigrant. So I live there, and that's where I work also. I am a consultant at Microsoft. That's my daily job. So, just as part of what we do is we basically go talk to clients and help them on their modernization journey, and part of that involves talking about open source software and various services that Microsoft offers for open source, and things like licensing, how to handle those, other things like that. So uh, I'm also very active in the technology community. I run the Orlando.NET user group, and I also host the Orlando Code Camp, and I was a Microsoft Azure MVP before I joined Microsoft as an employee. Um, so that's me in a nutshell. I'm very involved in like I said, I'm very involved in the technology community, but I'm also a public speaker. So I speak at various tech conferences, code camps, meetups, and other things like that. And I'm really happy to be here speaking to you because I think this is my first time, being on a show that's based out of Africa. And hope things are going well in Lagos.
Yes, thank you very much, Santosh, and for that introduction. So I think we should jump straight at it now. You know, the topic, open source and Azure. So let's begin with what open source really mean. So
Mhm.
how do you want to explain this to our listeners, people that will be viewing this at a later date now?
Oh, good. That's a great question. So, what does open source really mean? This kind of reminds me of the story of, where you take five people and blindfold them, ask them to touch an elephant, and one of them will touch the tail and say that this is a snake, and the other one will touch the tusk of the elephant and say that this is a knife. So, each person has their own definition of open source. Instead of defining open source, I like to think about it this way. You have computer software. Computer software are kind of like books in a library. Some are old, some are new, some are good, some are bad. Every now and then, the authors of the book release new editions. This new edition has improved content and less mistakes. But once it's published, the content is kind of static until a newer edition is released. Now, this is how regular computer programs work, right? So let's move to open source. I think of open source more like a content of a web page that's wide open on the internet. So the way I think about this is, you have a web page that's wide open on the internet. Anyone can come and read it, and it's free. And then there is the author who is kind of overseeing the web page and making sure that things are in order. And then there are also people who come in and they propose changes from time to time. Like if if there's a typo or something like that, they can say that this is right. If they want to add information to a certain section, they can do that. And the author, who in the open source world is also called the maintainer, has the ability to more or less approve or reject these changes. So, it's a very wide open and usually it's a welcoming community. And it's the new way of, I should say it's the 21st century way of writing software.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. Santosh, there's a huge contribution now on the part of Microsoft towards open source community, right, in recent times. So I want to check with you, why is it that Microsoft decided to embark on that journey of providing support to the open source community?
That's okay. This is a long story, right? So Microsoft has been around forever, about 50 years and approaching 50 years, I guess. Microsoft became really big in the 90s. So the way Microsoft grew was they got big in the personal market and enterprise software markets in the 1990s. So this was basically based on various marketing strategies, and Microsoft often used to write their own software. And so what happened was at one point, Microsoft, in the 90s, open source, also started becoming big, like, Linux and other things. And, there was a certain period in Microsoft's history where the open source movement was may or may not have been viewed as a threat to Microsoft's, business strategy and revenue and other things like that. So, there are various things you can read about it on Wikipedia, like, the Halloween documents and other, internal communication that kind of talk about open source and, how Microsoft viewed it as a threat. So as a result, in the early 2000s, the company kind of had um, a difficult relationship with open source. So I think this was also largely on the side of the management, because if you talk to a lot of people who worked in the company during that period, like not the management but more the software product teams and others, they were very uh, curious about open source and they wanted to participate and other things, but it was not within the strategy of Microsoft. Again, all of this is available on Wikipedia and the internet, so you can read about it. There's no secret here, right? And Microsoft had this kind of war with open source during the early 2000s. Microsoft, Steve Ballmer, who was the CEO at that point, kind of likened open source to a cancer. There's a lot of, consternation, or, there's a lot of conflict over there. But in the early part of the teens, which is, 2010 to 2020, that's when the attitude started changing, particularly after Satya Nadella became the CEO of Microsoft. In fact, when he became the CEO, I think it was in that when during his unveiling is when he presented a slide that said Microsoft loves Linux. So that kind of was a warning shot that Microsoft is joining open source, right? It's becoming more welcoming to open source. So Microsoft started to adopt open source into their core business, and and then you can see it throughout the past decade and the current decade. For instance, when Microsoft acquired GitHub, Nadella said that we are all in on open source, and I kind of paraphrasing what he said, but that should give you an idea of how their thinking evolved from being against open source to being all in on open source. It's kind of like a complete 180. So, as the industry has trended towards cloud, embedded software, mobile computing, Microsoft has kind of adopted open source and even become a leader in open source to make sure that their domination and their involvement stays ahead of the curve. Hopefully that
Oh, okay.
explains yes,
Yes, it does. It does. Now, I want to also ask, ton of people use open source softwares, but I know it's not enough to just run open source softwares without giving back, without giving something back to the open source community. So I want to check with you now, how is it that, how does Microsoft participate within the open source space, and what is it that Microsoft is also doing to give back out to the open source community?
Okay, great question. So how does Microsoft participate in open source? You can kind of see that over the last 5 to 7 years. I think it was back in 2015, Microsoft co-founded the Node.js Foundation to increase the open or to kind of streamline the contributions to Node.js as in the open source world. And then Microsoft also joined the R Foundation, and as you know, they incorporated the R programming language and Microsoft SQL and other database services. So that's kind of already been there for 5 to 7 years. I think in 2017, Microsoft joined the Open Source Initiative, which is like one of the biggest open source kind of foundation/organizations out there. And also joined the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. If you're not familiar with this is the foundation that handles open source projects like Kubernetes and other things like that. So, if you look at it, they've been part of those communities for a good, half a decade or more. So, they have kind of been, doing this for a while. In addition, also, I think it was 2014 or 15, Microsoft created the .NET Foundation, and that was Microsoft's way of, improving their participation in open source development and collaboration, particularly around the .NET framework. So they've been at this for a while. The other thing Microsoft employees are encouraged to do is that there is something called a FOSS fund, FOSS, that is within Microsoft, and it's called a free and open source software fund. And it is a way for the employees of Microsoft to select open source projects. And then these open source projects will receive like $10,000 of sponsorship awards. And this happens multiple times a year. So, even Microsoft's employees can select projects that they're super passionate about. So, obviously, you can tell from the, not just the public contributions, but also how Microsoft operates within that they have really been involved in the open source world and participating and giving back a lot to the open source community.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much, Santosh. I want to ask you about how licensing with open source works on Azure. I know one of the cool things that I like about open source on Azure is the fact that you can migrate to Azure with your existing open source license commitment, right? So, but it would be nice to hear from you, being that, you're one of the Microsoft guys now. How does this really work?
Okay, so there is a Microsoft, if you want more information on this, there is opensource.microsoft.com, and they have a lot of good information on this. But I can also tell you from my experience that I do a lot of migrations from on-prem to Azure. And this sometimes involves things like Red Hat, Enterprise Linux, and other things. And customers can kind of use their existing or an unused Red Hat Enterprise Linux subscriptions in the Microsoft Azure cloud. So Microsoft has developed various partnerships where people who are not just in the Windows but also come from open source backgrounds like Red Hat Linux, they can kind of their licensing is handled very well by Microsoft. The other thing you have is in the Azure cloud, you can simply spin up VMs with open source operating systems like Ubuntu and Debian and other flavors. And because these are open source Linux, they're much cheaper compared to, let's say, a Windows VM, right? So that's, and then within Microsoft, there is this Microsoft open source program. And I think it's managed by a open source programs office, and it has experts from various teams across Microsoft. It's a community of open source experts and leaders and curators within Microsoft, and they offer guidance and policy on various topics related to open source. There is something called a One Engineering Systems team, and they're kind of the experts for Microsoft employees to teach them how to use, how to contribute, how to release open source software. But there is also something called Open Chain. And Microsoft is Open Chain conformant. And this means that when you receive open source from a company that follows the Open Chain standard, a lot of the big companies all the big tech companies are pretty much part of this. Um, when you receive open source from a company that follows this open chain standard, you can be assured, 100% assured, that the code went through this rigorous license compliance process. So you can just trust. So they take away the pain of you having to go and do research every time you use any kind of open source software or licensing. And you can simply trust that Microsoft has done the background research and you're good to go on licensing. So I think that's a huge. I talk to a lot of customers, and to them that's a huge burden taken off of their chests.
Okay, Santosh. This last question that I have for you today, Santosh, is talking about the future of open source now. What is the future of open source on Azure, and what is the future of open source generally now at Microsoft? Do you mind? Can you?
Yeah, sure. So we'll kind of talk about some of the important things that Microsoft has done. So in 2014, I think .NET went open source in Microsoft. This was when Satya Nadella became the CEO. So .NET framework is open source. Microsoft acquired Xamarin. I think this was 2016 timeframe. And with Xamarin came the Mono framework, and Microsoft relicensed the Mono framework under MIT license, which is pretty permissive license that anyone can use. And they also released WSL for people to use Linux on Windows. And in 2017 or 18, Microsoft acquired GitHub, which is the world's largest open source repo. So the future is kind of bright in terms of Microsoft and open source. Like you have the .NET framework that's open source, but also Azure SDK, VS Code, Blazor, Dapper, PowerShell, Windows Terminal. All of these are open source now. So you're kind of looking at Microsoft as one of the biggest open source contributor, if not the world's biggest open source contributor already. So the future is pretty bright. Azure is already majority Linux, like most of the workloads on Azure, like the majority of them are Linux. I don't know the exact percentage because once upon a time it used to be like 25%. Now I believe it's more than 50, but I stopped keeping tabs because it's always increasing. So we have I guess we have to stop thinking of open source as something that is not natural to Microsoft, and instead we have to start thinking of open source as the default state for Microsoft and Azure. And one of the areas that I feel like Microsoft will really make an impact is open source security. So there's a lot that's been happening around security in the past few months, and Microsoft joined the Open Source Security Foundation last year, and this helps improve the security of not only Microsoft software but also open source software because there's a lot of collaboration. So I feel like this is kind of just the beginning, but it's also always trending upwards. So it's a positive. There's a lot of positive momentum in that area.
Yes, thank you very much, Santosh, for joining me on the show today. So this is where we're going to draw the curtain on today's episode of the show. So guys, remember you can have a rewatch of this on YouTube. So the channel on YouTube is the Tech Talk Wednesday. So you can rewatch this particular episode and then the previous episodes that we've done in the past. So before we say bye-bye now, is there any last words from you, Santosh?
Yeah, so what I will say is if you have not participated in open source, you can use opensource.microsoft.com as a starting point. When you go to opensource.microsoft.com, they have various resources on how to get started, not just like what Microsoft is doing. It'll also point you to various projects and how to get started contributing to various projects. So that's a great place if you haven't contributed to open source to kind of look at that and see if there is anything that interests you. So, and Kazeem, thank you very much for having me on your show, and good luck to you with everything.
Okay, thank you very much once again. So you've heard it from Santosh now. So on that note, it's bye-bye from myself and Santosh, and let's do this again another time.
Hey, sure. Thank you. Take care.